And right now, we're having a nicer experience of more ease and people back in schools. But it's been a long haul and it's a lot of after effects. And many families have been impacted differently. Some people have lost family. Some people can't see their family as much due to health reasons. There's a lot of strain still. Thank you. Um, so I just want to acknowledge that this is the world we're in addition to having a war and just a lot of feelings of uncertainty happening in the world that are impacting everyone. So today we're going to talk about trauma. I'll define it and give a lot of context about what's happening in our minds and bodies with trauma. And we'll talk about how babies and young children are experiencing domestic violence and then how we can be of support. But in keeping with a trauma-informed approach, I want us to start out with a mindfulness activity because trauma impacts the body and this information can be kind of heavy. And I want to do the best that I can to help us all have some sense of ground as we go through the presentation. So this activity is a resourcing exercise. And I like to start with resourcing because inherent in trauma is a lack of safety and not having enough resource. So I'd like us to do a resourcing activity. And I have a rose on my screen because a rose for me is a resource. My great-great-grandmother Emily immigrated to the US Virgin Islands with 10 children. And she had to do that because her husband had fallen off of a roof and had become disabled. So she no longer had a breadwinner. And she had a brother on St. Thomas, which is where I'm from. And she came to live there. And I was like, I used to ask my grandmother, who was raised by her, how did she do it? She moved with 10 children. She didn't speak English. She didn't have a lot of money. And she said, well, we farmed and she had a little plot where she would keep roses. And we knew that during the time she would go down there, she would go there to pray, that we weren't to bother her, that we were to let her be and have some quiet time for her to be with nature, with her beliefs and her faith in God. And that sustained her. And this went through the generations because my grandmother also was very much a gardener. I unfortunately am not, but roses still are a resource for me and they remind me of the strength of my family. So this is an example of what a resource is, but it doesn't have to be a thing. It could be a song, it could be your beliefs, it could be a pet, a special person. So what I'd like you to do is bring a resource to mind that works for you. And if nothing pops up, feel free to use the rose. And if you're comfortable to do so, I invite you to close your eyes. And if not, find somewhere to gaze that's not distracting to you. And just settle in for a second. Notice that your legs and feet and your back are supported by your chair. And I invite you to offer yourself some soothing gesture. Maybe place a hand on your heart or your belly, wherever you'd like. Just notice the warmth and pressure of your hands. Now bring to mind this resource and just think about some of the details of the resource. Does it have a smell? Does it move? Think about the resource for a second. What is it that you like about it? Now I'd like you to imagine that you have nostrils on your chest. And I know that's a little strange, but roll with it. Because when we're stressed, we sometimes constrict our breathing. So the idea is to open space in our chest. So I want you to think about breathing through these nostrils on your chest and giving some air inside your lungs. And think of your resource and all the good feelings you have when you spend time either with that resource or thinking about it. What's it like for you as you take some breaths in of this, giving space in your lungs and your chest. And as you exhale, just letting go of stress. Just take a few breaths. And when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes and release this practice. So let's begin with defining trauma. Trauma is a nervous system response to a real or perceived threat to physical or emotional well-being. And I really want to highlight that it's in the body, because many people think of it as, oh, it was a car crash or a DV incident. While it's true that there are events, it's our bodily reaction to the events that define how it impacts us. And often there is a shift in people, their understanding of themselves, of others, and the world changes. Trust is often impacted because there isn't enough safety. If people feel more vulnerable and maybe and often powerless because there wasn't enough support inside themselves or in their context. So since we are going to talk about more extreme forms of fear, I wanted to start with talking about what's developmentally normal, because we all have these fears. It's part of being human, and we have them throughout the lifespan, and how we are responded to when we are little affects how we then are impacted when those fears come up again. And COVID has affected us in all of us because we have a whole community experience of being impacted by having a pandemic that's impacted some of these things. So fear of separation is 8 to 24 months. And with COVID, we have had the experience of people not having been able to been with their families. And even though people can be together more now, that still had an effect. And worrying about losing people, which comes to fear of love, which is 18 to 36 months. And when there's a lot more stress, there's sometimes more irritability in parents. And so kids may feel like they don't have the love of their parents. Fear of body damage, 12 to 36 months. Just like you get fear of being bitten by a dog or anything that could impact your body. Well, COVID is a potential thing that could have impacted anybody's body, and it still can. Fear of being bad, beginning of moral conscience, 36 months to 5 years. So, wanting to be considered good is a big deal. So all of these happen throughout our lives, and how they're happening early, how we responded to early affects us. So there are things about children, and then there are things about context that impact how trauma affects us. So in terms of the considerations about what's happening with the child, the age of the child is actually really pivotal, because the level of brain development, the stage of dependency they're in, impacts how vulnerable they are. And often we hear things like, oh, they'll grow out of it. Oh, they won't remember. And some kids may have less vulnerability if their context is different, their genetics are different, but often having earlier trauma is more impactful because your whole system is developing, all your ways of being in relationship, your body, your immune system. It's all much more vulnerable if you are little. The constitution of the child. Was this child exposed to substances in utero or domestic violence? What kind of stress was happening for the mom impacts the child? What are your child's skills and capabilities? Can they walk, talk, read? Do they have ways to have more defense? And if there's been previous trauma, that's a toll on the nervous system that's more impactful. So what about the context? The context matters too. The frequency in which something happens to children, the duration and the nature of the trauma. It's way more impactful if it's if it's something that's happened more often because you've been afraid more times. The nature of the relationship with an abuser. If a child has been abused by someone they are supposed to have as a trustworthy adult, an attachment figure, it's way more impactful than if it were a stranger. It affects boundaries and trust, the level of invasiveness, what happened to a child's body. The more invasive, the more traumatic. The degree of violence, which is similar to the invasiveness, how much violence did the child experience? And did anything happen to their body? Systemic inequities, that's really a big factor too. What is the context for this child? What social class are they in? How do they present in terms of their gender? What's their race and ethnicity? All kinds of factors impact what will happen and how this child is perceived, whether they will have stereotypical negative expectations that impact how they are understood, how they are supported, how they are helped. And what meaning is attached? Does this child think, well, I'm bad and that's why this happened to me, or I deserved it? Or, God doesn't like me if they have a faith. Any number of things can be wonky in how meaning is attached to what has happened. And if a child comes forward and shares, say, sexual abuse to a significant person in their life and they are not believed or judged harshly, that's really wounding because you're trying to now get help and you can't get it. And then another part of the context is what's happening in relationships. What's the calmness and responsiveness level of the caregiver? Because that affects whether the child is going to be able to be regulated together by this caregiver. And did they get help right after the event, or did they stay afraid a long time by themselves? And is there a context where there's a network of people who are aware of the child's needs and understand behaviors from a lens of trauma versus a lot of judgment? And so are teachers involved? Is the family and the friends, the church, whoever this child's circle is, what do people understand and how are they perceiving why behaviors are occurring? So it's essential to talk about biology with trauma. So this diagram is a diagram of a resilient nervous system. And, the arrows are like kind of how arousal happens in your nervous system. So if you have a child in a caregiver who are not super stressed, what will happen is when normal developmental stressors or contextual stressors happen, the caregiver will most of the time be able to respond and build in some support to co-regulate the child so that over time the child can internalize that and be able to regulate. So when this is true, what you see in terms of behavior is the child is playful, they're affectionate, they're respectful, they're listening, they're cooperative. And what you hear in the parent is they're calm and the hands are gentle and they're listening, they're problem solving, they're seeing options. This is what it looks like when everything is fairly well regulated. But say there's been trauma in the child's history or the caregivers for that matter. There's some kind of stimulus that returns that the child has that brings them back in time to that trauma experience. And this could be internal, like, somebody smells a certain deodorant or an alarm sound from a siren going by for a fire truck, or pains in the body. But there's no intentional recall. There's no beginning, middle, or end. It just comes. And there are times too, like anniversaries, like children in foster care, if they got removed during a Halloween time, then every Halloween is a huge trigger, for example. So when this is happening, the body's activating to help the child to be safe because we are wired to survive, to continue to survive. So that stress response will come on, and we'll talk more about that. And if the child has had intensive stress, like where you would say even post-traumatic stress, they may have flashbacks, nightmares, challenging behaviors, or their parent might for that matter. So here's a compromise window. So before we had the nice, arousal, being managed. But here we have a trigger happen, and then potentially the child or the caregiver is bumped up into the high level of arousal. And that's when you see edginess, irritability, anger, pain, lots of hyperactivity behavior, vigilance. Or they may be bumped into the low zone, like they may be more depressed, they may be more isolated, more flat, or they may be going up and down. Like I often have people say, this child's bipolar. And while pediatric bipolar exists, it's not as common as trauma that may be impacting this child, because the window of tolerance isn't that wide, because they may not have had enough support, so they can't regulate as well, because that still needs to be repaired. And so when you have compromised windows, you see the behaviors that are often the reasons for mental health referrals. The child may be destructive, they're hitting, they're teasing, they're defiant, they're running around, they're impulsive, or they may not do things like that. They may do the internalized into the body, where they may be well behaved, but they have a lot of somatic challenges. They have stomach aches, headaches, they can't sleep. And with the parent, when the parent is compromised, you see them making threats and punishing and yelling and criticizing. They're not patient, they're hitting, they're tired, or they can't sleep, which impacts everything. Or they may cry easily or be lethargic. So in keeping in mind the nervous system, we have to keep in mind brain development. Brain development happens from bottom to top. When we're born, we are born with the brainstem intact, ready to go. And that means that we are born for survival. It's managing our regulation of breathing and our stress response, fight, flight, and freeze. So we are born ready for defense as a survival thing. The limbic system is what gets, and the prefrontal cortex get developed more over the course of our entire childhood and lives, but in terms of maturity, as we would think of it. And the limbic system is involved with how emotions are regulated, and that has a lot to do with how relationship happens. And I like to say how the love happens, because we all want kids who think things through, who sit and do their work, who are cooperative, all the things that go with civility. But that thinking and planning, all of that can't happen without having had relationships that provide support. And of course, there are kids who have different kinds of neurodevelopment, and even though that is all true, then there are things that may impact them. Like if you're on the spectrum, for example, it's still true that it matters how relationships happen. There's just more challenge, but it's still true. And so when there's trauma, depending on when it happened and if it happened early, we may not have as much wiring going up to the top to create this, because there's always fear, there's vigilance, there's seeking, like, how am I safe? So it matters what happens repeatedly, because neurons that fire together wire together. So we literally have the power to develop our brains by how our relationships happen and create within our dynamics a sense of safety. So in this diagram, we are looking at the PET scan of a brain on the right of a Romanian orphan who was institutionalized shortly after birth and had a lot of deprivation of relatedness. And on the left, we have a healthy brain, a PET scan of a healthy brain. I would like someone to, unmute yourself and tell me what you see as the difference between these brains.
There's space and some missing things.
Yes, absolutely. And what do you think might be the effects of that?
I would say like their thoughts, the way they think about certain things.
Yes, they're going to think
The one on my
differently.
phone actually.
Process things differently.
Yes, they will process things differently. Yes. Anyone else?
Yeah, it looks like the abused brain is larger. The temporal lobes area is a lot larger than the healthy brain.
Yes. And it's larger because it's less active. Like if you look down at the bottom at the little the little key, the most active area on the abused brain is the brainstem. See how red it is? It's much more active because this child has spent more time being afraid. And the frontal cortex is much less active. Like if you look at the healthy brain, it's very red. And the temporal lobes, everything is much more connected. And so there's different things that are going to happen because of this. The child on the right is probably going to be more reactive, probably won't be as good at thinking and relating and being calm during stress or regrouping during stress. Whereas the child on the left is more likely to be functioning more as we would wish development would have been going on course. So what that tells us, because this is not a typical client, right? We don't typically have someone that's been institutionalized, but I wanted to use the diagram because I wanted to really highlight how interactions impact brain development and literally how we then behave. And so if there's repeated empathic engagement, that can provide corrective experiences that wire a brain and it creates relational dynamics with the parent and child. And that's really our game, our aim. So stress is important to talk about because stress impacts how we think and function, and also trauma is affected by our stress. So there's a range of stress. On the top, we see positive stress. And so stress gets a bad rap, but we need stress to grow, right? Like if you have to learn to walk or get along with others or take turns, all of that's a little stressful, but it's how we grow and develop, right? So when we have some of the typical developmental stress, we have brief increases in heart rate. Sometimes there's mild elevations in stress and hormone levels. When we move into tolerable stress, there may be serious things that have happened, like you got in a car accident, for example, but it's tempered by you having supportive relationships. So even though it's something really stressful, you can manage because you have bonding. With toxic stress, there's prolonged activation of stress, which affects our whole bodies, and there's not enough support in relationships. And we need relationships, especially, I mean, we all do, but especially when we're very young because we're so dependent. And so if that stress response keeps staying on, we're taxing our organs, we're taxing our endocrine system, our hormone system. So development gets affected. So adverse childhood experiences, this is important to talk about because a lot of adverse childhood experiences do involve violence. And let's define it. An adverse childhood experience is something that's potentially traumatic that's occurring in childhood from 0 to 7 years. This can be direct experiences like abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, or it can be more indirect, it's in the context. So the child's home life, that something that's undermining their sense of safety, stability, and bonding. So parental substance use, parents not going to be as attuned. Or if the parent has mental health issues and aren't supported properly, they're not, again, going to be tracking their child's needs as well. If you've lost parents because they are incarcerated or even deceased, all of these, or you've separated and you've moved to another place and your parent lives in another state, like all of these things affect the child's sense of safety and stability and bonding. So like, how did this even come about? It's actually a kind of an interesting story, how we found out about ACEs. Dr. Vincent Felitti, he was a doctor at Kaiser San Diego. He ran an obesity clinic, and he noticed the trend where some of the most successful people who could lose weight would drop out. And he was like, what is going on here? Why are the people who are succeeding dropping out? So he had this idea to send out a questionnaire. And in the questionnaire, he asked them about their early childhood. And these were the questions he asked about, these from the original ACEs study. He asked about physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, physical and emotional, if there was anyone in the family growing up where there was a mental illness, a substance use issue, someone in prison, if there was witnessing of a mom being abused, and losing any parents to separation, divorce, or death. And what he found was many of the people who had responded did have ACEs. And what he found is like 50-something% of the people that had dropped out had had childhood sexual abuse. So they had used eating as a way to protect themselves from potential sexual advances. So this is something that he was like, this is really fascinating. He goes to do a conference and talks about it. And someone from the Center for Disease Control was at the conference. And then they decided to partner and do a large scale study. And they use Kaiser members, like 17,000 Kaiser members, and they sent out the questionnaire to them. And what was amazing was that so many people had at least one ACE. And if they had more than one ACE, if they had one, they were likely to have more than one. And the other fascinating thing is the average age of the people in this study was 57. And so what that told us is that something that happened in childhood like 50 years ago was affecting the health of the people today, right? That's what they discovered. And this was a really like massive discovery. And that's still like what we have seen from the continued research to date. And so here we are talking about childhood and violence in childhood and how not only does this affect all the things like learning and whatnot now, but these same kids may potentially have problems with health or mental illness in the future. And this is where we think about, well, what do we do? So there are now other ACEs that have been added to studies formally, like war or terrorism effects, natural or man-made disasters. So now COVID is like a natural almost disaster, witness to school or community violence, sexual exploitation, medical trauma. Like I have to do, as a Medi-Cal provider, we have to do an ACE screening with our families. And all of these questions are on there as these are now added as part of the scanning process. So there is an ACE dose response relationship. As the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for negative outcomes. And that's because toxic stress is demanding to the body. It affects the heart, blood pressure, breathing, muscle tension, and the stress hormones, the immune system. All of this, having more ACEs, you're adding to the strain in the body. So there's an increased potential for future mental illness and substance misuse. And sometimes it's a reduced ability to respond and learn. But while I say that, I also want to balance what I'm saying with the reality that when I began, I talked about trauma being in the body. Well, so are other things, so like people have different genetic histories and they're in different environments and there's different things that provide support, either the child's strengths, the family strengths, or the context, or maybe some important person. So there are different ways that someone who has a lot of ACEs may not have the negative outcomes. It's not a guarantee, it's a correlation. And it does matter each nervous system and the context of that person. That being said, there are social determinants of health. So social determinants of health are conditions and environments in which people live, work, play, worship, and age that affect health. So systemic injustice, where you live. If you live somewhere where the air is more toxic, You have less options for healthy food. If you feel unsafe a lot and you aren't protected by the police as much. If you're spending a lot of time and money transporting yourself to work, so you're then impacted by your income, what kind of housing you're in, everything, all of these things, your income level, all can affect and add to your stress level. So, and it can also affect the people who are supposed to be there to support you. So if they are more, if people are having to work several jobs or stress about childcare or worry about housing and all of that, they aren't going to be as available for your stress because they're so stressed themselves. And that can exacerbate the impact of ACEs. It can contribute to more ACEs. And so it speaks to the need for much intervention on many levels about how we structure supports for families of all families. So we began by talking about trauma feeling a sense of threat and not feeling safe. So how is it that we tell that we are safe? This is through a process called neuroception. It is how our nervous system evaluates risk. And this is happening without our awareness. Our bodies are reading our cues of safety or danger all the time. And so some of those cues are inside ourselves, like if my shoulder is starting to tense or my tummy is feeling tight, it's sending messages to my brain that I'm not as safe. What's the tone of voice of the person talking to you? How are they gesturing? You know, are they making you feel scared? What does the other person seem to be feeling? And how is that impacting how I'm feeling? So this is all happening unconsciously. This is not the same as perception where you are thinking about something. It's happening automatically, and that is part of our survival as humans. Our system is very interconnected to read our organs and our environment, and a lot about facial gestures, tone, prosody to determine if we are safe. Here's the challenge. If a child has had trauma, they often have faulty neuroception, and it creates lots of behavioral challenges. If children feel safe, they play nice, they share, they cooperate, they think about other people's feelings, they take turns, they have empathy. But if they don't feel safe, you get fight, flight, freeze behaviors, which we will talk about more today. And so they are not going to do the things you want them to do, and they're going to be more taxing for the teachers, and it's going to be harder to make friends and harder to learn. So what do you do about that? How do you help? That really requires a great deal of patience and nurture and messages of safety and knowledge about how a stress response is appearing, because then you can then tack differently with what you do as a caregiver. So what happens for a child who has faulty neuroception? You have some normal thing that happens, right? Like, for example, say someone comes to the classroom and they are going to be, dropping something off. It's a stranger. The child doesn't know if the stranger is a good person or a bad person. And this is a pretty typical thing that might happen. Someone drops off something, but the child has their response to this that's afraid. And however it shows up for them, fight, flight, or freeze, they might try and run out of the room, say they do flight. They can't take in some message about safety very easily from a teacher. And then they stay hyper alert because they just never feel that they're going to be okay. And it goes round and round. There's all kinds of different ways that there be cues happening in the environment. And there's often not enough support or personnel that may not know how to be responsive. But if personnel did know and caregivers did know that this child just feels unsafe, and what would you do? Well, if you didn't feel safe, what would help you? What would you do to help someone else to feel safer? What would you say? How would you approach? It's not a cookie cutter thing. You take chances and you try. And over time, the child can be helped to feel more safe. So what do you do? What may be behind the behavior? Behavior is always communication. And what's the child's developmental stage? Is this typical? Like if they're having a tantrum and they're 2, that's typical. But if they're 6, that's maybe not so typical. Are they in fight, flight, or freeze? And how is this a solution on their part to create safety? Because they have limited skills. And as they age, they get more skills, but they're trying to create safety in the best way they know how. And it's probably not the best way. And so they need help. And that's narration about safety, but it's also help to calm their body. So our target is to be safe in relationships, that they feel that you are there for them and that you will support them and that you have skills that can support them. So that brings to mind, what's it like to be in relationship with you? They have a desire to connect and a drive to survive, because that is human. When we looked at the brain diagram earlier, that the brain stem is what we come into the world already fully mature with that part of the brain. That's because we are driven to survive as a species, right? But we are also desiring to connect. And especially very young children, they are, it's a huge threat to their safety if there's anything that affects their bonds with their caregivers, because they're dependent and they want to feel connected and safe. But if they feel like the person may be a threat in some way, there's always this balance that happens, because what you ideally want is the child can come into this caregiver, parent, teacher, whomever, for support. But if they don't feel safe with that person, they're not going to do that. So they still stay upset, and it sets off all the other developmental things. So what will create safety? The quality of our tone of voice, our gestures, our eye gaze, and our proximity. We are definitely reading each other all the time, back to the neuroception. And then that is being messaged to our brains about what we do and how we feel. And if we feel safe, we are going to be socially engaged. We're going to be learning well. And if we don't feel safe, you get more of the stress response behaviors. So first step is to regulate, to help the child to calm their stress response using probably relationship and activity, sensory tools, talking to them about what may be happening and what they could do differently, and reasoning. So like, say someone doesn't want to share, right? So like they go and they grab something, and you say something to them, oh, the toy was busy, and you get down on their eye level, and I know you want to turn. I wonder, if we can just wait 1 minute and take a breath, and then they'll say, no, he's not going to give me a turn. And then once you've helped them to feel like you're there and you can help them calm, then be like, okay, so what can you do instead? Well, you can ask for a turn. You can go to the teacher. You can play with something else. Like, you can't get to reason without calming down the brainstem. And you do that through the limbic system by relating. So I'd like to talk about babies because people often think that babies aren't impacted by trauma. They don't remember. They'll grow out of it. But babies are impacted. And the ways you see it, the way the hyper arousal, like the higher energy level in the diagram earlier, you see a lot of fussiness. They're inconsolable. They have difficulty being soothed. They have a heightened startle response. Their backs arch. They have difficulty settling in. They have difficulty sleeping, eating, stiff muscle tone. These are examples of where they're hyper aroused. And hypo-aroused, they look more vacant. They sleep a lot. They're more floppy. They avert their gaze. They're not wanting to connect. They're not as responsive to interaction. And they may not signal. They may not cry as much. So how are babies who experience domestic violence impacted? Graham, Fisher, and Pfeiffer in 2013 did a study with 6 to 12 months olds, and they had them come during their normal nap time, and they put them in an fMRI machine, which means you can actively see what's happening in the brain while it's happening. And they had babies from homes that did not have conflict, and definitely from homes that did. So while they were asleep at their normal bedtimes, what the babies heard was a male voice saying nonsense sentences, but they did it with tones: neutral, happy, angry, and very angry. And then the fMRI machine, they were taking pictures of the brain. And what they saw is that all babies process emotional speech while they're asleep. And then homes with higher conflict, they were more sensitive to the very angry tones. So even while sleeping, babies can hear, and they are impacted by violence. So now, if the universe will align with me, we're going to stop this share and look at a video called a still face video. So let me see if I am able to pull this up without difficulty. Okay. And then I want to share screen, share sound. Can you see, oops, I'm sorry, that's not what I want. We'll get there. This is Ed Tronick. He is a famous researcher.
Babies this young
Can you see?
are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Area
So what we just saw was just like 2 minutes of relatedness, where mom went from being very connected, disconnect, and then reconnect. And because they have a good relationship, this child was able to restabilize fairly quickly. But I want to highlight that that was 2 minutes of time with a healthy relationship. And so if you have a child who's afraid, who's witnessed violence, that you see how dysregulating it was for a child who seems pretty healthy to just viscerally understand how impactful it is to a young child who may not have available caregivers to support. So how do we help? So we notice cues. You try. They respond, and you see what the baby tells you. Things you can try are like cuddling and warmth, changing the position, rocking, holding, dancing, balancing between rest and stimulation, and soothing sensory input like a white noise machine. Like when my son was very little, I didn't even have, I just turned the station to like, and then he would be able to be managed, right? So babies, they're not going to give you words, but they show you by whether they settle or not. And you try things. So you have to watch for cues if the baby's feeling overwhelmed, if they need less stimulation, a quieter environment, smoother movement, less bouncing. And if things aren't working, you have to stay on, because if you don't stay on, what does the child learn? I'm by myself with my distress and nobody will be there. It's really hard to have someone be crying a lot and feel helpless, but they won't cry forever. And you try things as much as you can bring yourself to some sense of calm about your being there really matters, because it does really matter. So now I'd like to pause and do a mindfulness moment. We're going to do a compassionate body scan. And so I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable to do so. And if you don't, just find somewhere to gaze that's not distracting to you. And I invite you to put yourself in a relaxed and aligned posture. For now, there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. And there's no one to please. Just let your shoulders relax and take a breath. I invite you to offer yourself some soothing touch. This could be a hand on your heart, holding your arms, whatever you'd like to do. Just notice the warmth and pressure of your hands. And just take a moment to notice your body. Let's start with your head and your face. Notice if the muscles around your jaw and your eyes are holding any tension. Just invite those areas to relax. Offer yourself warmth and affection. Notice your neck. We often hold tension there. Just gently let your breath enter. Feel the muscle fibers have more space. Notice your shoulders. They hold a lot. Give them compassion. Take a breath. I invite you to shift your focus to the stomach, another place we hold tension. Just give your belly permission to relax. Calm and loving presence. Drop down to your pelvic area. We sit a lot and our hips hold a lot of tension. Just notice what's there. Send affection. Draw your attention to your thighs. Is there any tension there? Invite your muscles to just let go. And as we end the body scan, how are your feet? They're small surface area, but they do a lot of work. They hold us upright. Take a deep breath and send down warm affection to your feet. Let's close with 3 deep breaths. I invite you to offer yourself greater soothing by doing a longer exhale. I'll count. Inhale and exhale. That's 1. Inhale and exhale. That's 2. Inhale and exhale. That's 3. When you're ready, gently open your eyes and release this practice. So now we're going to turn our attention to young children and how they manifest trauma. In order to be trauma informed, you have to be able to see the trauma. What is it? So how do young children show us that they're traumatized? Often through play. There's a repetition of what's distressing. You'll see repeated themes. Sometimes you see changes in biorhythms. They were good sleepers, now they're not sleeping, for example. Changes in activity levels, maybe more active or less active than what they typically may be. New fears and avoidance behaviors. I had a child who never had a problem going to the bathroom, and then all of a sudden she was afraid that there were spiders in the bathroom. More irritability and impulsiveness, more inattentiveness, somatic complaints, headaches, tummy aches, fevers with no medical reason. Regression to earlier levels. Often you see someone start having potty accidents that was already potty trained, or they start talking like a baby, but they had perfectly fine language before. Or you see developed milestones being delayed. I have a child who has had a lot of medical intervention and has not been in school because of the fears of the COVID. So he's has more difficulties with socialization with kids, but is fine with adults, as an example. So what does the impact and exposure to violence on a young child's relationship? What happens? So if you're repeatedly afraid, you get brain wiring that is more in the brainstem, but you also get less trust. That lack of trust impacts how they are in other relationships and how they just feel about being alive in the world. So how does trauma repeat in families? I'm going to explain this, and then I'm going to give you a case example to make it clear about violence. So a parent has past experiences that creates a model of how they are to be in relationships. This creates expectations of the child and how the child is supposed to behave. And then the parents selectively attune to certain expectations. The child learns, okay, this is how I must behave, and behaves that way because this is what it's like and needed to stay close to this parent. So I'm going to tell you about Sammy. We'll call her Sammy. Sammy was 5 years old and she was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So she was very high functioning. Both of her parents had histories of domestic violence with other partners. They weren't violent with each other. And this child had teen siblings who had witnessed physical violence from previous partner relationships in the home. So Sammy herself had never witnessed violence, but there was regular arguing and tension between the parents and the older siblings. So in 2 school settings and aftercare, Sammy does not display any physical aggression. So 8 to 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, none. In the home setting, she's pretty aggressive when she's with her family. So when when I began the assessment process, I was curious about this because to be in 3 different settings and not exhibit this problematic behavior and for so many hours a day, but then have it be at home, what was that all about? So at the time, I was doing home visits with this family, and you know, you learn a lot by just being with people in their normal environment. And what I observed is that the parents had a tense relationship, a lot of criticism from mom to dad, and dad would take it. And what I observed is this child who had, you know, her own challenges with relatedness, she would watch what they did. And so she would be very verbally aggressive to dad, and he would do nothing. But she would never be physically aggressive to dad because he would set limits. And with mom, she would never be verbally aggressive because mom would always set a limit, but she would be physically aggressive. So I was like, this is very curious. So one day we are all there in their room, in their living room, and the child is on the bed over there because it was a bedroom, living room. Child's on the bed with her older sister playing and all of this. Mom is standing in front of me telling me about the weekend, and dad's on a big beanbag on the floor. And so mom was been talking for a while, and the child wanted her attention. So what she does is she comes over to her mother and she slams her really hard on the chest. I was totally stunned. And it wasn't my chest. I was like, wow. And the family did nothing. Dad continued to talk about the weekend, and mom, you know, just stood there for a second. So I said, is this okay with you? And she's like, she can play a little rough. I'm like, is this okay with you? And they're like, well, you know, she's got special needs, da, da, da. And I'm like, well, she's at school all day and aftercare and a special needs classroom, and she's not hitting anybody. So I started to point out to them, like what I observed, which is that she would be physically aggressive to mom. Mom was a victim of physical violence. So even though they had been in a marriage for 12 years when nobody was violent, she was triggered by aggressive play and wouldn't set a limit. But verbally, no one was going to mess with her. She was a person of agency in the world, but still she wouldn't set a limit with her kid. And dad, he would take verbal abuse from this 5-year-old. And I'm like, this is your child. It's just not acceptable for her to talk to you like that. And so we had to do work to help each parent shore up how they would set limits about the issue and support each other, because the other one had an opposing strength. But what I want to convey is, I'll go back. Each parent had an experience of violence in their history, and that created models about what they would or would not set limits with. And the child learned that. Here's a child on the spectrum, and she learned that. And she learned what to attune to and how to be with them. So I said, you know, this thus far hasn't, you know, migrated to other settings, but it will, because she will build these habits more and more. I'm like, what do you want? And they're like, well, of course we don't want this. So we had to do work, and mom had to talk to dad differently. They had to change their couple dynamic, and dad had to support mom when she would get triggered so that the limits could be set. And so over time, the aggression decreased. But what's so powerful is that even in a home where there wasn't no longer violence, they were, before intervention, creating a child who would be violent in relationships that were intimate. It's pretty amazing. It was like the most clear experience I had ever had as a clinician about how trauma repeats based on what you respond to or don't respond to. So I've talked a lot about the stress response. Now we're going to look at it a little bit more. So there are 3 components to the stress response: fight, flight, and freeze. So fight is probably the easiest to see. It's when someone's argumentative, they're confrontational, they're kicking, they're hitting, they're biting, butting heads, destruction of property, screaming and shouting, swearing. This is what it looks like. What does it feel like in a body that's in a fight response? There's tension, there's readiness for action, for a fight. The heart's beating loud. Maybe there may be nauseousness because, you know, the blood's going to the extremities, ready to do something. Or maybe they may be even feeling like they could pass out because they have so much arousal. It depends. So how do you help? You know, I mean, when a child's in a fight response, that's a lot of arousal. How do you bring them down? And so less language, because when you do too much talking and someone's very hyper aroused, it's lost on them. So, you know, we want to be safe. I'm going to keep you safe. And before you go all into consequences, remember that diagram? First, we got to calm down the responses. So we have to stop anyone from hurting someone else. You have to separate kids, having someplace else to go. And that doesn't have to be like some special safe space that you've created, but if you have one, that's great. And things that help a kid breathe, because it's really hard to tell a kid to breathe. So things like a pinwheel, you know, let's do some deep breaths, right? That's a way. Or bubbles, all from the dollar store. Sensory strategies. Sometimes kids can get calmer if they can do other things to exert. Play-Doh, a weighted blanket, different things work for different kids. It really is a trial and error process. Some physical activity. So I'm going to tell you about a case. This is the most extreme fight response I've ever experienced in being a clinician. I'm going to call this child Roy, who was also 5. And Roy lived with his maternal grandmother, who was his legal guardian. And he had witnessed and was physically harmed by domestic violence between his parents when he was a toddler. And so his big trigger would be abandonment. And when we were in therapy, we would be in the playroom. This was a playroom-based case. And it would be Grandma, Roy, and myself. And when he would be triggered, it would be most when it was time to end the session, because I would not be with him. I would be, in a sense, abandoning him. So he would be extremely violent. He would flip the table. He would try and kick me. He would scream loudly. I mean, on more than one occasion, I needed an ice pack. And Grandma was, to date, the best grandma I have ever worked with. And she would be in this process with me. So what we decided was he was not someone who could stay in the playroom with his level of arousal. He was a very strong boy, very athletic boy. So what we did in order to just survive, because how the heck was I going to do any therapy under these conditions, is we moved outside. And we went to the parking lot, and she had lots of different sports things because he was athletic. So, and I'm a terrible athlete. So he got to feel very confident because he would throw a football, or I can't throw it, go over there, you know, like, so he would get into educating me about how to do it right. And he would calm down. But what was he getting to do? He was getting to kick, he was getting to throw, all socially appropriate behaviors that a fight response inside wasn't going to be okay. He couldn't kick me in the playroom or throw something at me and bust my head, but he could throw a ball, he could throw a frisbee, he could kick a soccer ball, we could run around the parking lot. And so this is what we had to do for some time when he was more triggered. And like a DV cycle, what would happen is he would be on some days more triggered, and they lived like, you know, 35 minutes from the office. So like 20 minutes in, when they would leave, he would say, she's going to hate me. Like when he used to get so upset, she's never going to like me, and feel such remorse, right? So I would have to like call and say, you know, I don't hate you. I know you're learning what to do with your big feelings, and we're going to get better at it, right? So he's a young boy with intervention, right? So like, you know, argue, honeymoon, you know, hit, like that would, in an adult, would have been a different set of circumstances. But he's a young boy who was frightened a lot. And the trigger, abandonment. which brings us back to the ACEs. And there's a lack of safety that happened and an impact to his bonds because he isn't with his parents. And so that is so like in his nervous system. So we did this, and I wasn't alone because he was at our school. So we had a behavior specialist that worked with him. And so he got a lot more support during the day. And then he eventually left our program and went on to a special day class where there was also support. But there's hope for this kid, right? Because he's getting the regulation he didn't get. There's an understanding about what the behavior means and not his badness. And ways to help him develop more mastery of his feelings in ways that work. Like he's a good athlete using his strengths to be in relationship. And then he did come back to being able to be in the playroom over time. And when he's not triggered, he's great imagination, really great symbolic play, the whole thing where he would feel happy, but he had a lot of suffering. So we're going to pause and do a little vignette activity. So how about this? You have a 5-year-old child who's with his mom and siblings in the waiting room for 30 minutes. And they're waiting to meet someone to talk about a family violence episode that had happened the day before. The 5-year-old is yelling loudly, hitting his 3-year-old sister and refusing to share toys. He screams no to everything his mother says. How would you think about this child and his behavior from a trauma-informed perspective, and what interactions would support him and his family? I'm going to stop the share so we can see each other. So their families all activated, and they're in a public space, and there's a younger child. How do we help them? How do you understand it? Well, first ask the question, is he in a fight, flight, or freeze response?
Fight.
Right. Definitely in fight. And there's a lot of different people involved. There's him, there's his mom, and his sister. So what are things that we could do that might help calm the situation? What would you do?
Talk to him calmly.
Yes. What kinds of things would you maybe say?
Maybe like some soothing words like calm down. If you need to take a break, maybe make some eye contact and come down to his level.
So coming down to his level,
Yeah.
eye contact,
Yeah.
okay, and tone of voice.
Yes.
So those things matter.
Maybe offered him something else to do. Like, if he's in an office, maybe they have some other toys or things that can calm him down, where he can go sit by himself for a few minutes. Seems like he's overstimulated.
Right. So he's very hyper aroused, and they're all going to be anxious, right? So are there things that are in that office? Maybe Play-Doh, something that can be soothing, calming. Any other ideas? Validate his feelings from Charlie on the chat. Yes, I know you're upset. Meaning, I see you. You're not alone.
I was thinking of maybe just moving away from the waiting room area just for a few seconds, just taking a little walk outside of the area to get us some water, or just having a different view.
Yes, because he'll calm down a little bit. And water is very calming. That's like a great regulation strategy, because you have to pause, you have to breathe, you have to take it in. And depending on where your office is, right? If you have a nice, safe place to walk, just to go for a walk around the block even, that could be helpful. Any other thoughts?
I think we have to regulate him at first, then relate. And the third is respond.
So the first part is the regulate, And because he's in a fight response, he is going to need help to do that because he can't do it by himself. And mom may not be able to help him right then either. So the ideas that people have talked about are all good ones, like your tone of voice, getting to his eye level, having something sensory to do, maybe going for a walk, maybe a glass of water, all these things that could help. And I think it also bear in mind that his mom is there and his sister is there. And so waiting rooms, it kind of matters what you have to do and what the options are, and to have things that are soothing, you know, that does matter, like things that are sensory soothing, and water. Someone says, yes, taking conscious breaths with him. Swastika, yes, absolutely. You know, like if I were on a desert island, you know, if you gave me pinwheels, Play-Doh, and bubbles, I'd live. And so you know, these are not expensive things. They're easy to have in a house. They're easy to have in a calm kit. So these are ideas of things that can help him to breathe, because if you handed these to them, it immediately adds a little less tension to the moment, right? They cost $1 at the dollar store or something. And it's a way to breathe that is socially, it's like, it doesn't make you feel like something's wrong with you that you're sitting there. You know, it's just easy. So let's go back. All right. So the flight response, what does flight look like? Running away, covering the face and hands, maybe the jacket gets over the head, avoiding, baby talk or silly voices, hiding under tables, daydreaming. What's it like in the body of that child? They are ready to run. They are ready for action. They're jumpy, they're tense, their heart's moving fast, their breathing is fast. They may even be nauseous because everything's moving so fast. So how do you help? You got to maintain safety, especially with the runners. And so physical closeness, if you know a child tends to run in parking lots, to protect them from the street, be cautious, like if you're at a park, making it predictable. You know, first we're going to do this, then we're going to do that. Giving familiar and easy things to do, helper jobs. And if the child does need to run, what's a place they can go hide that you're okay with? And sometimes sensory supports help kids. Sometimes it's using that jaw muscle because it's calming. Drinks, blankets, it depends on a child. But physical activity, jumping, bouncing, where they can jump safely and run safely. So this is my other extreme case in my work experience. I'm going to call him William. He was also 5, and he was reunifying with his mother, who had a long period of separation due to substance use. He was living also with his grandparents, and he was exposed to domestic violence in utero and in the first year of life before he was separated from his mother. But in addition to that, because his mother was using substances, she used to leave him alone. She used to leave him in his crib and cover the crib, figuring that was keeping him safe so he wouldn't crawl out. But then he was by himself in this box. And so what do you think his survival strategy would be? I've got to run, right? Because he's learned that I can't get out. So that's how he developed. And so how I'm talking to you about, all these different things, tone of voice and physical proximity, all of that. Well, I got none of that, because the first day he came to our office at WeCare, he came with his mother, and she, of course, is anxious. Here she is. She feels bad about herself. She was using substances. She's clean. She's trying to make good with her kid. And, they come to the door, and the first thing she wants to do is use the bathroom. And the way our building is situated, the front door is the furthest place from the bathroom. The bathroom's at the back of the building. So I turn my head to start to tell her where it is. he pushes through the door and runs out. And it's 6 o'clock because I'm doing these late sessions because I know this kid would probably be more rambunctious based on what I knew about him at the intake. So no one else is in the building. It's dark, and he bolts out of the building and runs. And we don't know where he's gone. And I don't know this lady. I don't know him. And so I have no relationship and all these tools and telling you about, I didn't have any of them. I thought, oh no, I should have been a freaking attorney. And so I now have to go and separate from mom to look for this kid. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job because this child's going to die because we live right near the highway. Work right near the highway. And so she finds him. And, her heart's boom, boom, boom. And we get back to the building, and then he's running around the cars because now she's found him, and now he still wants to play tag. So he's really still very upregulated. And we get him inside, and she asks him, why did you run? And he goes, to save the cats. Apparently, on the way in, they saw these cats by the side of the road that he's like, they didn't have their mommy. And, they may need a help. This is what he told me. So this child's trigger was that his mom had to go to the bathroom. And so he ran out of our building, risking all kinds of life and limb to save cats who didn't have their mother. So his mother's right there, but he felt like she wasn't. And so he had to go save these cats. And so we had to do a lot of work in therapy because then we had to keep him inside. Like, how the hell are we going to keep him inside the building? So that's where I had to get help. So I asked our OT for help. She loaned me a small trampoline. I had a big exercise ball. I took a lot of stuff out of the room. Like, this is not normal life at WeCare. I'm like trying all these things. I made like a streamer on the floor. We locked all the doors. We put little hotel cards, red, red, red. These are not doors you go out. These are doors you go in. I mean, it was like a setup every week to make sure that this Bronco kid would stay in the building. And then when he was in the room, he would want to hide, and he would want to hide under the tables. And so mom would yell at him, "Get out of there, stop that." And I'm like, it's okay. He's safe in here. He could hide under there. Just give him a little time. He'll come out. And he would. So it's like helping her to get calmer about how he is and helping to keep them in the room. And so what ended up being a great intervention for him was hard chewing gum. And, like the old bazookas, if anybody knows chewing gum, like that is what would organize him. Like, it's a deep tension in your jaw when you have to chew really hard. So it would get to the point where he would walk in the door and say, "Okay, Roxanne, I need my gum." And then he would be whatever, woo, and then he would eat the gum, chew the gum, and he would calm down. And we would get into play. And so I want to convey, like, this was a frightening experience, and it's the most extreme situation I've ever had of flight. But he did all those things. He ran out, he would hide under things, and we had to learn ways to help him regulate. But mom in particular had to do language that would create a sense of safety. Like, now I'm like, anytime you have to go to the bathroom, get down to his eye level and say, "I need to go to the bathroom. Do you want to go with me, or do you want to stay here with Roxanne?" And so she would do this every time so that he would not feel like she was leaving him. And over time, things got better. They were able to have dialogues about the past. "You left me." And she's like, "I thought I was keeping you safe. I just wasn't in my right mind then." And so like they did get to greater repair. And he wasn't running out of buildings anymore, but still had a lot of trauma responses and, a lot of activation, but it got better over time. So the freeze response, what does that look like? That is zoned out, daydreaming, staring into space, looking tired, being unresponsive to questions or commands. It's harder to see this one. What does it feel like in the body? Everything feels like a dream. It's foggy, it's numb. You can't focus on words, but you can hear tones. So how do you help this child? Well, you have to stay with them. And, you know, if they've zoned out, they're out. So when they return, you let them know that they're safe. You remind them gently about what it is they're supposed to be doing. Make tasks smaller, more predictable. Again, sensory things sometimes work for kids. You can try stuff. Physical activity, maybe having them push their hands down on their seat and lift themselves off the chair. It kind of puts you back more in your body. So both boys that I've talked about, both of them had freeze responses as well, but especially William. And he would just stand there and just stare. It would just be like he's gone. And mom really got really good at this. She would just tap on his toes and say, you know, hey, buddy, we're here. And he'd come back. It's all right, we're here. And it would be okay. So that was the case of William. So a cardinal message from today is that whatever kids are doing, it's an attempt to feel safe, as they don't often have control over what scares them. And they're trying their best with the skill set that they have to be safe. And so they need help to make sense of what's upsetting, and then have interventions that help. Like that little boy, both boys were triggered by abandonment, which makes sense, right? Because they both didn't really have their moms. And once that was understood, that was the trigger, then you respond differently. Rather than he's bad or yelling at him or whatever, taking away comes, you know, all of this stuff, it becomes like, how can I help you regulate? How can I help you feel safer? So all the responses, fight, flight, freeze, they all have some similarities. Physical proximity, you know, we feel safer when someone's close, if their gestures and tone of voice and verbiage is offering safety. How you approach them, your empathy. Sensory interventions vary. Like if I had tried to give Roy hard chewing gum, it would have been useless. Or if I tried to do, you know, sports activities with Williams, it'd be useless because they had different needs. They're individuals, and you have to try things based on what you understand, and you figure it out as you go. Movement is actually really important because there's a lot of arousal in the body. So, you know, playing catch, jumping on a trampoline, these were things that work for these more extreme situations, but there's other kinds of movements too. You can just, I think at minimum, playing catch can be very helpful because there's reciprocity. You're going back and forth with someone, so you're building connection. And assuming that it's not harsh throwing, it can provide some rhythm and calming. So to repeat, first we regulate the stress response. And we're relating. Sometimes it's not so precise. You're doing the relating as you're regulating. Then you move to reason, because often traditional ways are like you go to reason and consequences, but not the regulation or the understanding about what is happening. Stories are a way to talk about feelings. These books were written by Chandra Ghosh Ippen, and she is the co-creator of the child-parent psychotherapy model that we use with domestic violence situations. And she wrote these great stories that talk about feelings and use animals. And not all the stuff for animals. Some of them are pots, like Holden pot, it's a pressure pot that gets too angry. But she kind of covers different things: fear, sadness, anger, loss when parents have substance histories. So this is not a comprehensive list of books, but it's a way to start. You can look these books up, and if you go on Amazon, you'll say, well, people who bought this, and you get other ideas. And then, you know, kids have different favorites. But what I wanted to do was show you some pages from the book Once I Was Very, Very Scared, This one is all about the stress response, but it's made into a kid format. So it's very easy to talk about it. Because I think sometimes caregivers really want to help, but they don't quite know how to navigate a conversation. They don't have the words. And stories can really give you that. You know, if they're skillful, they can give you the words, and it can open up a way to have a conversation about incidents that happen. So if the forces will align, I'm going to stop share and switch to the book. Hang on. Okay. Are you able to see a storybook? Yes? Okay. So this is from Once I Was Very, Very Scared. And this is where she's using animals to talk about tough stuff. So someone I love left. I don't like it when people leave. They leave a lot. People were fighting. I hid, but they kept fighting. They went on and on. So let me see if I can move this. Hang on. Okay. So here's like the flight response. I need to run. I need to go home and find my family. So you might say, I hear that you want your family and I know you want to move. Let's find a safe way for you to move around, right? Turtle, please don't go away. Leave me alone. My tummy hurts. So here's like a freeze, you know, they're getting the somatic responses. Oh, it seems like you all got upset, but you show how you feel in different ways. Let's think together about what might help. So the animals go through and they talk about how they affect each other. You are really loud. I have very sensitive ears, like for example. Well, here, if anyone bothers you, it's my job to help them learn not to bother you. It's my job to keep you safe. Here, you don't need to growl or bark. You can just tell me what's happening and I will listen to you. Then we will decide what to do. Can we try that? Yes, but I might forget. And then it's like, well, that's okay. You're learning and we'll help you to learn. We want this to be a safe place where you don't need to bark or growl or bite. That's true. Biting is not safe. Sometimes it's hard for us to talk about what's going on inside us or figure out how we can calm down. And then I just want to go down to, all right. So here's the coping. Music helps me calm down and, you know, a little bit more. I still like to run, but I also found a safe place where I can be calm and snuggle. I talked to my mom and she said that she was very sorry that someone hurt me. This makes me feel much better. I will keep you safe and make sure no one ever hurts you again. So, these were examples of ways to have the words. And that book in particular is kind of longish. And young kids sometimes don't have like the longest attention span. So you may have to be selective and skip some pages and go with what you know about your child. But it's ideas of ways to have a conversation. And all this stuff I've talked about today, it's making it like kidified. The next thing I wanted to suggest are calm down kits. And these do not need to be pricey. You can get a lot of things from the dollar store. But again, this is individual. but having something that can help a child where they have agency, where they can both use relationships, but oops, what happened? I'm sorry, I hit my mouse. Where they can have agency to choose. Like I had a little girl who had a lot of trouble sleeping in foster care, and it would create tension with the resource mom because she'd be like, look, I'm tired, it's been a long day, she takes forever, I've been very attentive, and there would be tension. So I suggested building a calm down kit with her where they decorate a shoebox and they think together about what are things that are comforting to her. And so they built this kit. So she would stay and she would read a story and rub her back. And she's like, okay, I'm going to bed now. So she could use her kit either at night or when she woke up in the morning to have things that she is choosing how to soothe, but she did have support. And so examples of things are Play-Doh. A glitter bottle is basically like a hard water bottle, like the brand, I forget the brand. There's a brand, Voss, I think. They have really great hard cylinders. And if you use clear glue and, food coloring and glitter, these are things you can put in there and you can shake it up. And when you're upset, you just watch it slowly settle. And it's also an activity you can do with a kid. Manipulative things, some kids really like to have something to fidget with. The books, some kids like books, some kids that have nothing to do with books. Aromatherapy can also be very soothing because it's just scents. Some people are very soothed by scents and other ones couldn't care less. So you have to try pinwheels, bubbles, hard chewing gum. And then a good one for anger are TheraBands. Like TheraBands can get bought in different tensions and you can shove one of those in your purse or in your back pocket. And it's a way to manage when you feel angry, but you have to cope and you're in Costco or something, it's just a way to manage that is a doable tool. And, that same little boy, William, his mom had a terrible domestic violence history and he was angry with her. So what do you think? She was very triggered by loud noises. So he would always make loud noises. He would crash the cars and all of that. So then it would be destabilize what could be a useful time for them. So I'm like, you can be angry, but your mom has asked you like lots of times not to crash the cars. So here's what you can crash instead. So I gave an alternative. So I started collecting egg cartons and carton, like not the styrofoam kind, the cardboard kind. And so I would keep them, and some sessions he would never need it. And other ones, okay, how many eggs do I have to eat? Like he had so many that he would be jumping and smashing because he was so mad. But it was an intervention that worked for their family because she couldn't tolerate the crashing sound. She would become triggered. And when triggered, she was not responsive to him. And so she would want to leave, and then that would trigger him about abandonment. And then I'd be like, I should have had a flower shop. And so, that was what we came up with. Another good one is bubble wrap. That is a great one for anger. Like you can twist it, or it can be soothing to just pop one at a time. And that's easy to get in the store, or even in your packing. So sensory things are helpful. And Thera Putty is different than Play-Doh. It has different tensions and it can be a hot mess in a house. So you have to think about that. But these are ideas of things that are practical that you can use. You can have in a waiting room, in a car, in a house, at school. Like I had a child who was very hyperactive at school. So they used to have what they call lap buddies. And it was like a sitting helper. And it would be like a weighted band of material, kind of like a weighted blanket, but it was just like a band. And he would sit better because he needed that sensory input. Whereas another kid would care less about that because their body doesn't need it. So, you try different things. So that brings us to the end of today. And I'd like to do a mindful activity and then open up for any thoughts or questions. So I would like to do a self-compassion, loving kindness meditation. As before, I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And if you aren't, find somewhere to gaze that's not distracting to you. Just notice right now how your body's feeling, the sensation of your feet touching the floor and your bottom touching the cushion, the weight of your arms and your head. Just be in your body right here and right now, fully inhabiting your lived experience. Allow your attention to locate sounds, but try not to reach out to them. Just let them come to you. Focus on your breathing. Just notice as you inhale and exhale. Let your breaths be nice and easy. Notice the peacefulness of being quiet, of resting as you gently breathe. Bring into mind something that was challenging to you today, that has made you feel discomfort or maybe even inadequate in some way. Try to get in touch with what this feels like and what it is about it that's upsetting. Now notice the sensations in your body that go with that upset. Is it the tightness in your throat? Maybe this heaviness in your heart? Or tension in your shoulders? Just allow the feelings to be as they are, natural feelings that arise in the body. Now I invite you to take a hand, or perhaps both hands, and put them gently over your heart in a calm, soothing, reassuring way. Maybe even rub it in a circle. See how your heart feels. We're going to do some self-compassion affirmations that you can offer yourself. We all have discomfort. We all fail. This is human. So I'm going to say some phrases aloud, and I'd like you to repeat them in your mind. May I be safe. May I be peaceful. May I be kind to myself. May I accept myself as I am. Feel the warmth of the hand on your heart. Have the intention to offer yourself kindness and acceptance. And remember that every one of us has unmet needs. We all struggle in some way in relationships. So let's alter our intention to include everybody. May we be safe. May we be peaceful. May we be kind to ourselves. May we accept ourselves as we are. We're going to close with 3 breaths. I invite you to make your exhale longer because it's more soothing. I'll count for us. Inhale and exhale. That's 1. Inhale and exhale. That's 2. Inhale and exhale. That's 3. When you're ready, gently open your eyes and release this practice. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm opening up to any comments or questions. Evie, is that correct?
Hi, it's Eve.
Eve.
So I'm a clinical social work student and I'm working with a child who has witnessed violence. And I was recently talking to my supervisor about using like occupational therapy techniques to support her. And I'm kind of curious how you see that in relation to the intervention that you do with children. Do you see it as like a preventative thing, like that, like a skill that you're building up, or do you see it as like central to the work that you're doing? I guess, if that makes sense.
I understand. I feel like sensory strategies are a support, and the skill you're building up is focusing on how to provide regulation to the body. So not every kid uses sensory stuff. I use the cases I described today, the 2 boys, those cases needed intervention like that, but not all cases do. But I feel that generally, like, I've never met a kid that doesn't like Play-Doh or pinwheels, like these are things that provide support to regulate the stress in the body. So I don't feel it's a requirement, but it's a support. And I think often it's a great support. Like I use them all the time if parents will let me. Because I've had parents who are like, I don't want any of this stuff. I'm not going to use it in my home. I have 2 other kids. I'm not going to be able to do this in Costco. Like they're just, they don't want anything to do with it. And other parents are so grateful that they have things that can work and they feel like they're not alone and they have tools.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Any other thoughts or questions?
Well, I'll say something. I just think in terms of how we treat children, small children, many times we may not be, I don't want to be accusatory, but I think it's challenging to be mindful of all of these things when we're dealing with children in the moment, so that this needs to be practiced, and it does need to be practiced also with adults, because I think it's hard to just check yourself right now in these really rough moments. And so right now in my personal life, I have quite a bit of things going on. So I identified with a lot of this stuff, even though it was for children. I really saw a lot of this in me, about the whole idea of just wanting to run away from it and hide and all of that. And I think that that's a natural thing, but I do appreciate the background and the understanding of how some of this can become or be coming from in utero experiences, and being exposed to that at that time. Because I know that we've heard, oh, well, this child was just born evil, or this child was just, it's just been mean all their lives. And I don't know that we've, that might be a way of misdiagnosing or mischaracterizing their trauma. And so that we begin to punish a child without really understanding what happened to that child. And so all this information is wonderful, but it's got to be brought in and synthesized with what they do on the daily, and then constantly be reminded about this, so that it becomes a language that all the staff are using, and that we learned how to separate ourselves, our emotions, our moods, from what's happening, and so that we can focus on the child. And that requires practice too. A lot of this work is subtle, it's esoteric, it's not in your face. And so that's where the nuance and the delicacy comes from with all of this information. And so looking at children now, you can look at them as little beings, but also, you know, understanding the behaviors. And so there's a lot to unpack here. But I do want to just highlight how some of this might be misinterpreted, misdiagnosed. And so really working with staff to say, well, you know, if this child's a problematic child, like your little Bronco that you had there, then, you know, then maybe we need to sit with that child for some time and ask them in a childlike way, you know, what happened to you? And really begin to look, or even, you know, turn to the family and ask them what happened, because this is what we're seeing. And we want to bring out, you know, make the invisible, make it visible so that we're able to deal with it. Thanks
Oh,
for, and
there's so much that you said there to chew on. I'm like, which direction do I go in? First, thank you for your share about your own self. And I think you're not alone. I think many of us have trauma histories, and you're trying to make your way through the day, and you have your own ways of having been parented, and that is true for everybody. And to circle back to when we started about what's the context that helps traumatize kids, is that there is a network of people thinking similarly. And that does matter on how staff, what's the philosophy of the places that the children attend school. Both of those boys attended We Care State Preschool, and they were connected to behavior specialists. So part of why they were both able to heal more than may have happened in another environment is that we all were working together. Like, they had the philosophy of, how do we provide regulation? How do I give you that contact and help you navigate those social challenges when you're triggered? That they had that extra help, but a lot of kids don't get that. Or they get the behaviorist that's not relational about trauma. They might be like, you know, this is the consequences of this. And so it really is a philosophical pivot to go to what has happened to this child, what is happening physiologically, and what do we do? It is a pivot, and I wouldn't say like we are like clear out of the woods, you know? I mean, like, this is work. And it's work even at where I am, where we're really in it to win it with this philosophy. You know, people have histories, you know, they get triggered and they get tired. And so it does matter that there's mindfulness about how people are taken care of as well. Like, how are staff taken care of? Like, what's the self-care messaging, and how are people being, you know, how are they getting breaks? You know, how are they getting trained?
This is Shannon with the Family Justice Center. I just want to say thank you for also including the importance of looking at intergenerational trauma and how that shows up. And I'm also very interested in epigenetics too. And so how they all interplay and interweave with one another, and how when you have a situation with a parent, how because of the traumas that they've experienced, they're not able to set those boundaries because they're being triggered. So thank you for bringing that up as well.
Oh, you're welcome. And almost 100% of the time, parents have trauma histories that I work with, almost 100% of the time. And we do long-term therapy because we understand that it's like you're really working with two sets of relationships, the one inside, the one in this one, the parent, there's a lot. And just to name the reality of historical trauma and all those social determinants of health, how the US has developed over the course of time to impact African Americans, other groups. so that there aren't situations that are as supportive of all those things, the schools, the transportation, the food options, like all the things that affect health and feeling pressured and being able to get work and get to work, and all of that is exacerbated and affect.
You froze up, Roxanne.
I'm not for sure what happened.
Oh, there you go.
Hi, I'm not sure, I was talking away, but I don't know what you heard.
You cut out, so we missed that portion.
The whole
Sorry.
thing- The whole thing cut out?
You actually froze up.
Oh, I'm sorry. So what I was saying in regards to intergenerational trauma, just wanting to really name historical trauma, and that just the whole history of the creation of the United States, you know, genocide, forced labor, and then how then housing was laid out, and how homes are able to be bought or not, and for generations, and how food is only through convenience stores in some places, and overpriced and junk. You know, like there's so many things that are impacting people, especially people of color. And so that's all in the mix too, about all the ways that we are impacted in our nervous systems and whole groups being impacted.
Roxanne, I just wanted to add just a couple of more things. And one of them is the impact that poor diets might have on behavior as well. So many of our families are come from food insecure communities.
Yes.
They call them food deserts. And
Yes.
so I remember in West and East Oakland doing a lot of work around food justice issues. And so food definitely impacts behavior, especially as you get older and adolescent. When I was working in the high schools, you know, your breakfast, lunch, and dinner is a Arizona tea and a hot Cheetos. So that's going to impact your behavior, your ability. So children are the same way. And then the second thing, I think more than once you've talked about social determinants of health, and very specifically what you mentioned right now was about it reminded me a lot about one of the resources that's in the, I just put it into the chat, but it's unnaturalcauses.org, and it is a cornucopia of resources. And there's one in particular that is called Place Matters. And it really references the Richmond, California area, where before Richmond was a hustle and bustle, an idyllic community, a lot of work with the Naval Yard. Everybody was happy and thriving. And then the government saw that that was going to kind of end, and times were changing and become, you know, industrial ways were going away. And so they moved people. But when you just said access to housing, 99% of the home loans went to Caucasian white people, and 1% went to the African Americans. And so when all of that left, creates a vacuum. And what is left became, you know, what we would traditionally call the ghetto, but it's a poor community. And then that's where the other communities have come into. So then health becomes an issue. And
yes.
so there's so many things. But when I saw this resource, I really appreciated the storytelling way that they do it. And they give you these concrete ways of understanding the process, and these processes, like I said, it's not esoteric. They're doing it out in the open, but they're very slow. So you don't see the automatic injustice. You don't see the automatic negative impact. So this resource to me opened my eyes to a lot of different things. And then it was all about the health and the community and the individual and different races and stuff. So I would strongly suggest, you know, just using it as an interest tool, but also the fact about diets and how we live in communities that don't have healthy foods.
So you again brought up many roads to go down. Thank you for the resource. I also want to recommend another resource along that line. It's called The Color of the Law. It's a book written all about the history of segregation in the United States. And it focuses actually for a good chunk on Richmond, and how exactly as you said, there was a bustling naval yard, and then when housing was to be built, people of color had to go further away. So you're spending more money on transportation, you're taking more time to get somewhere, and more people having to live together. And so you're not having as much comfort, and just how it layers. And then, you know, who then has a house to bequeath, and it's all there. And as far as the food piece, I see this all the time. The families, that we are a full scope Medi-Cal agency. So I work with a range of families, even though all the kids have Medi-Cal, there's a lot of kids in foster care that are in an adoption track. So they're in more middle-class homes, but other kids are not. And there's a vast difference in how the kids eat. I see it all the time. Definitely the kids from a lower socioeconomic status home have a lot of sugar. So I see it too. And the parents too. I mean, like, they don't have as much money, so they're pulling a Red Bull and a muffin, and that's not going to help them be regulated when their kid's upset. So yes, food is actually really significant. So I'm just noticing the time, it's 12 o'clock, which is what we agreed to, 10 to 12. So I'm happy to stay on, but I just want to formally end so that people who want to leave can leave. And thank you all for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us at the Family Justice Institute training. Thank you, Roxanne, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you, everyone, for participating. It's through these conversations and training that we can do this work in a collaborative effort so that we can help our clients to move in a direction where they can heal. So on behalf of the Family Justice Center, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'm sure our paths will cross again real soon. And just a reminder, you will get a copy of the slide deck. So we'll make sure you get that. And then you'll also get a survey. Please provide us with that feedback. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.